pretty interesting is if you actually look at.
Right. Joe finished. You guys all set?
That's fine. We'll carry on, Mike.
All right. I can read this agenda. The first item is call the meeting to order. Changes to the agenda. Any changes to the agenda? Public comment period. No.
Happy to see you all.
Nice to see you, Madam Mayor. You go by Madam Mayor. Or...
Christina's fine.
Oh no, but you gotta be, formally you gotta.
Formally, I think it is Madam Mayor.
Madam Mayor.
That's
Okay.
my firm.
Well, congratulations again and welcome.
Thank you.
That's great.
Let's see. I can read this. Approve previous meeting minutes.
Minutes in the material that are at the table for you all from our last meeting on the 28th of February.
Anyone ready to make a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the minutes? Hearing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Initial review parking standards.
All right, so at our last several meetings, we went through a list of various items that I've been identifying since I've been here on regulatory updates that we should potentially explore. One of the items that was identified was regulations. This is also kind of from the adoption regulations in 2016. There was some discussion, as I've been told anyway, some discussion of the form-based code when that was included in the regulations, that there was some need to update the parking standards, but at that time it was decided to not go forward with trying to figure out parking in order to get the regulations adopted and in place so that we could start getting the development patterns we were looking for and that we would revisit parking at a later date. So in your agenda, I included a memo on just some thoughts and directions we might want to go in. I was originally thinking that I would prepare some language to bring to you tonight, but then I got to thinking that might not be a direction you all want to go in. So I figured it might be better to at least start the conversation with several options that we could explore and have a discussion on various options that we might want to look at as we go with parking. So in the memo, I got out 5 options, and then actually I was thinking of a 6th option that might be something we want to consider as well, which would be a fee in lieu option.
So let me interrupt you and can you review with us the existing parking ordinances?
Sure. So right now, so downtown is a separate entity for parking. There's separate regulations for downtown that are, I will say, fairly similar to our other parking standards. So right now, for our residential districts, we require, I believe it's 2 spaces per unit, 2 off-street spaces per unit.
Is that just if they're being redeveloped, or is it, is that
So
just...
that would be for a new development.
A new
If you were to build something now, and I'm gonna grab my phone here because I can't think off the top of my head, so I'll grab it quickly.
I think we talked
But-
about 2 units up to a certain number and then lesser as you had more units.
So for multifamily, that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah, I can get to them quickly here, and I will tell you exactly what they are. So in our residential districts, yeah, we require 2 spaces per dwelling unit and 1 space for every accessory unit.
Regardless of how many bedrooms there are.
Correct, regardless of the bedrooms. In all of our other residential districts.
No, I was just gonna ask you, kind of following up Terry's question. Existing properties are grandfathered in.
Correct.
But if I have a property and I'm going to add units, make some kind of a change, then I would have to meet these. When does that kick in?
So, parking is that's an interesting question because
Can you get closer?
parking is one of those things where it's, if it was a non-conforming use, we would want you to become conforming, and that would trigger some of the parking standards. But a residential use is not a non-conforming use. It's a conforming use in our residential districts. So It's an interesting question. I don't think we would require redevelopment or addition to a home to conform with the parking standards.
Right, but I guess where I was going is if someone wanted to put in a cottage unit or or
In
an
a case
in-law
like that,
apartment.
yeah, we would, yes, we would look at that probably as the accessory unit and make sure they had at least one space off-street for that unit.
But would we require them to come up with the two for the first, you know what I mean?
I don't think we would do that. I think if it was an existing home, or accessory dwelling, for example, I think we would only look at them making sure, I think we would only make sure that they had parking for the accessory dwelling.
And I guess then that leads to the question of an accessory dwelling is, I believe, is a right by law.
It is.
So if I have a single family house with absolutely no parking and no way to get parking on that parcel, I have the right to put an accessory dwelling in. Our hands are tied in that case, right? Or can we?
Well, there's provisions for how to meet parking. I mean, we do allow for off-site parking. We
Right.
allow for other options like that.
But that's not
but-
realistic for like a homeowner, single-family homeowner who may have a large lot but no accessible parking, like a narrow lot with a.
Potentially. There's on-street options as well that could be used. It's not ideal, but
How
I mean,
do on-street spots, like how does that?
so
how do you calculate
we
that?
do not dedicate on-street parking to any one property or any one use. It's part of the general parking inventory for the city. So aside from like handicap spots or 15-minute parking spots, everything is
So you're
public
saying like
domain.
if someone wants to build an accessory unit, they can say, I want to count a public space as my space, is what you're saying? Or,
So in some instances, we allow commercial uses that are near the downtown. For example, property across the street just redeveloped as a hair salon.
Oh, I thought you were.
No, sorry, not that way. This
Across
way.
that street.
This way, here at 35 West Allen, just redeveloped as a hair salon. They have a bunch of residential units in the building as well that are being served, that the parking that's at that property serves those residential units. So I believe there was only one or two additional spaces, if even that, on the property for the use. And so we allowed them to include the parking across the street, on the street, as part of their, to meet their parking count. But
can you imagine doing that with a residential, like single-family home for an accessory, or would that?
I mean, potentially if there's on-street parking in the neighborhood, we would probably look at that. It's hard to really say. But the level of nonconformance is really the question, though, with if a property is adding a unit, if they would have to come into conformity with the parking standards, for example. I mean, I think there would be other factors that would develop first, which would be so the use. So to go back to a statement you made, accessory dwellings are allowed in all of our districts, primarily. That wasn't the right way to say that. They're basically allowed in all of our districts, but you also have to be able to meet the standards of the district. So you can't just develop it because you can develop it. You'd have to still meet the setbacks. You'd still have to meet the lot coverage requirements.
Yeah.
But it is an allowable use by right. It's not. It would be the opposite. Would be a conditional use where it would have to go before the DRB to be reviewed and get conditions placed on it.
So we could put in there a requirement for if you're putting an accessory unit into your existing residence.
Mm-hmm.
We could put in there that you have to now meet on-site parking.
We
for
could.
that.
Yeah, we could. We could. So to go continuing on with our existing standards for residential uses that are not in our residential zones, so basically in our commercial zones or other districts, it's one space per dwelling unit plus a half a space for units that are 3 bedrooms or larger. And then for every 4 units calculated in increments of 4, it's 1 additional space.
Yeah, for guest parking.
For guest parking, yeah. And then for commercial, retail, restaurants, things like that, it's 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet. For hotels, it's 1 space per bedroom, 1 space per room. Theaters, it's a quarter of a space per seat. For industrial uses, it's 3 spaces per 1,000 gross feet. And for office, it's 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet. So that's as far as we go as far as the standard number of spaces.
So what have been the issues that have popped up?
So primarily where we've seen issues are in the gateway districts, where we are getting redevelopment and where we've decided as a city that that's where we want the redevelopment to occur. We want the intensity and the density along the corridors. In a lot of cases, in order to make those uses work, the parking spaces that are necessary are larger than the area they have available to redevelop. So they're getting into a situation, some of the developers that we've met with are getting into a situation where in order to meet the parking requirements, they have to scale the building down, which then makes it pushes their numbers to the point where they may not even be able to afford to do the building.
So as I recall, in the gateway zone, there is a provision for shared parking. So I guess what I'm imagining is that we haven't had enough development yet of adjacent parcels to take that make that happen.
To some extent. I mean, so shared parking is permitted anywhere, really. I mean, in the provision that we have in the regulations right now is for shared use, sites over 10,000 square feet in non-residential gross floor area may be applicable for shared use of the required reserved parking spaces, but no more than 60% of the reserved spaces may be shared. So that would be a situation where if it's a larger commercial development, non-residential development, we could get into some shared parking. In the gateway, there is a provision to try to connect parking areas in the rear of the buildings to kind of create a frontage road almost, so that people don't have to get back out on the main road. But there's not anything specific about number of parking spaces for shared parking. There are some general provisions for tandem parking and things like that in the gateway, but the number of spaces that are needed come back to these regulations.
And so the issues we're popping up against in the gateway district is that the lots aren't big enough to support what people are trying to do to get on-site parking for the use.
Yeah, or it's becoming too cost prohibitive to do underground parking or things of that nature, where they'd be able to get some more of the parking, but it just becomes a cost factor where it's not worth them trying to do it.
I mean, 2 spots per unit is a lot, especially considering the size of some of the apartments that are being built. Like,
One.
So in the gateways, it would be one.
Oh,
It'd be
it's
one
one
plus
per
one for every 4, because the gateways they're technically a non-residential.
Wasn't it 1 up to
Got
3 and over 3 it's
Up to 3 bedrooms and then an
Oh, up to
additional
3
half.
bedrooms.
Yeah, and then units that are 3 bedrooms or larger, it's a half a space.
So if you have a 4-bedroom,
extra.
it's 1.5.
Yes.
Okay.
So a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom is 1.5 spaces.
So if you have 1.5 spaces, do you have to give them 2? Is that how it works?
Typically, yeah.
We give them a half a car.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we generally round up with parking.
Yeah.
So
So, do we think a guest space is necessary in a gateway district? I mean, that's
There was a long discussion about that.
really.
Yeah, a very long discussion, and we met, I think consensus was there should be parking, but should it be for units, should it be for 6, should it be for 8, what's the cutoff? And we went 4, because the parking in that district is 1 per unit. We figured that, you're gonna have guests, so we need to have some extra parking there.
But then again, there is I guess it's not true in all of the gateway districts. Most of the gateway district areas have ample street parking options.
Well, I was gonna say, one of the issues that's popped up on
Yeah.
Upper Main Street is that they're doing so well, those restaurants up there,
Yeah.
that they're taking all the
That's true.
spaces on Main Street.
Right.
So that the people who have other retail spaces are getting blocked out. So that's
Yeah.
the conundrum you get into is you require all on site, or do you give them some kind of a what's the right word, a waiver, if you will, of the requirements and let them use on-street parking. But as you get more and more commercial uses
Yeah.
and
We're
are
gonna
more
run
and
into
more
trouble.
successful, you run out of
Well,
parking.
It
Yeah.
depends on what you're trying to achieve. I mean, if you think about downtown Burlington, how many people do you know who live in condos or apartments in downtown Burlington that have guest spaces? Most of them don't. I mean,
Well, I
you-
think guest may also be used here in sort of a liberal term. It may actually in effect be serving households that have more than one car.
Yeah.
I mean, because how
Yeah.
many people have
Right.
a live-in partner that also has a
that's
vehicle?
a fair point.
Right,
That's a fair point.
so I'm curious, I'm assuming the developers are raising these concerns. Is it about the commercial requirement or the residential requirement? Both, like, is it one or the other?
I don't know if it's really focused on one or the other. I think because we've had some developments where it's strictly residential, and based on the pro forma of the development, the kind of the expectation is that they're smaller units, people are going to be walking more, taking the bus, or they'll be marketing the units towards people, for example, that are going to be at the hospital. So they'll be at the hospital for 12 hours a day, so they won't need that space during certain hours, so that could be shared with other tenants. So it's
Presumably, I think there's a
well,
lot of
presumably,
presumptions about
sure,
these
absolutely,
spaces.
absolutely,
There's
but
also the opposite of that too. For instance, people work at the hospital and
Are
they're
not
causing
doing
their
Exactly.
right, exactly. But so in some cases, I mean, we do allow for some reductions in our total parking. We do allow for off-site parking up to a certain amount within a certain distance of the project. So we do allow for some relief right now from the parking standards. But I think in a lot of cases, when you're looking at the non-residential uses and the residential uses together, that nice mix that we're really looking for, if it's a successful business, then, like what we're seeing is, as Mike mentioned on Upper Main, there's a lot of pressure on the parking there.
Right, which is, I guess I'm sort of arguing that we shouldn't be changing this, because if there's so much pressure, and I heard it when we broke up into groups a couple weeks ago, when we had, or a couple of meetings ago, when we were talking about the bike stuff.
Yep.
And I think saying that there wasn't enough on-street parking, he was concerned about that. And if that's the case, then I don't think there's an argument for having less parking that's provided by the developer.
And if you recall that, the Main Street project has removed some of the parking
Right.
from
Right.
one side of the street all the way.
Right, and I think that was what triggered his comments. I can't remember if it was about that or something up here on Allen Street. But in any case, I mean, you're even seeing in the neighborhoods now, like my neighborhood, where there never used to be cars parked on Elm Street. Now Elm Street, there's cars on both sides of the street
Mhm.
now. And so I think the more pressure there is around here, the more it's gonna be in the neighborhood. So I don't think we should be relaxing these standards.
It was
I really don't.
part of my concern was also that a lot of the initial designs that were laid out for the Main Street revitalization were kind of based upon assumptions about form-based code being implemented in the district. Was that they were proposing eliminating a lot of the on-street parking because they said, well, these projects have been approved with a quota of parking for the number of units. So I'd be kind of worried if we're leaning up on this while also kind of removing some on-street parking to promote bike lanes and all the other things that came along with that redevelopment project. So.
That's true, but I do think we have a vision for what we want the gateway districts to look like, and we have to realize that if the requirements are too onerous or it's not possible within the space on the lots to develop that aesthetic vision. I mean, I imagine from looking at the form-based code, like storefronts on ground level with apartments over it, that would be ideal. That's what I think. And it's going to get first level garages that you're going to walk through in a lot of cases, because that's all that will be accessible on, especially on some of the more narrow lots. And it's going to change the feel and character of the city. And I understand these are complicated issues because we all would like the convenience of parking, but many cities have chosen to make parking a little bit less convenient in order to have that urban density, walkability, lively street facade. And I just think we have to think about that. I mean,
I'm
So-
kind of wondering, is it a complaint or is this actually restricting growth? Like, are
Right.
developers complaining
Right.
about this, or has this actually prevented significant projects?
And, I mean, if we look at it, development is going on, so I'm not sure it's restricting it.
That's kind
And
of,
going back to things you said, pallet, I believe, I probably am wrong, but the Gateway District, like the downtown, you can't have a parking garage
That's what I
open
thought.
to the street.
You can have the entrance on the street, but it has to be,
It has to be hidden, right?
right.
Has to be hidden
Right.
behind the
The street
building.
has to be
Behind
storefront.
or under.
Right.
so Eric, what do you think? I mean, you
Wanna
know
jump
what
in?
projects have been, I just,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it is a challenge to create that multimodal atmosphere with development while still giving the opportunity to drive more. So I don't really know what a good balance is necessarily, but I think in order to kind of get people to just park once and then walk everywhere, we have to make sure that we have enough parking in the right spots, for one, but at the same time be sensitive to the fact that we don't want cars being pushed into the neighborhoods and then just parking all over the place. So I think it's a good balance. And I mean, a lot of it is from the commercial side. I think that's always a challenge because you don't know how good or bad the business is going to do. So you could have 50 spaces for a restaurant and nobody ever goes to it. So you've got an empty parking lot the whole
Well,
time.
but if no one ever goes to it, that restaurant's gonna go away.
Right, exactly. So you might see a lot of turnover in some circumstances, but you also, you might get a situation where you've got a line out the door trying to get into the place. So I think in those cases, you're never going to have enough parking that's quote unquote convenient for people that want to be right there. So it's really a matter of how inconvenient do you want to make things for the non-residential component.
Yeah, and I think that if you take it, the vision was, as I said before, connected parking lots at the rear of the properties with like you call it a frontage street, and curb cuts, only limited number of curb cuts along Main Street. So if it was all built out, it may be that there would be enough parking because you could park, if not on this property where my restaurant is, the next one over where there might be extra spaces. You know what I mean? So you can drive, it's a back road an alley. So, but we're not there. So we're finding this crunch because you've got this finite parking area with nothing, to the east or south or, adjacent to it.
I just also would like to point out that Main Street, we are seeing a good number of projects, but our gate and one of our streets where we haven't yet seen as much. There are probably multiple reasons for that, but their parking potentially might be one because there are very narrow lots currently on Mallett's Bay. And I wouldn't want to discourage especially small development on some of those narrow lots, which could be, I don't know. I think, when we say there's a lot of development, sometimes we're talking about very specific areas, and this conversation is a broader conversation about the entire Gateway District, so I just want to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And I will also point out the option that Eric mentioned, option 7, which is not on this list, is potentially the fee in lieu option, which if there were a compelling project that came along that perhaps parking was not feasible, if we had a fee in lieu, that could potentially still exist. In exchange, the city could capture funds that could be potentially used for public parking improvements and that kind of thing. That could be-
Wouldn't that really, I'm not dismissing the idea, but wasn't the initial discussion that developers were saying that the costs associated with allocating that level of parking was making the projects not feasible? So wouldn't that mean that if it was a matter of just paying to the city to use their on-street parking?
Well,
that
the
would
cost
make-
doesn't have to be equal.
Okay.
I'm not saying the cost would be the same. Like, I think they would choose the fee in lieu option if it were more economical.
Mhm.
I think the reason Eric's saying that the cost would be prohibitive is that he's talking about like underground parking, which is much more complicated than if they have the space to just have parking on the back of the lot. They'll probably build the parking on the back of the lot. But if they don't have that space, to pay in, whatever it would typical developer to build on a lot. If they had space in a back lot, they could just pay that into a fund that could be
Yeah,
supporting
and that
other
could be,
parking.
and that could be better than just seeing somebody buying an adjacent parcel to level the
right
level the
into a
structure and then
parking
put
lot.
parking there.
But I think you have to
Exactly.
be careful because, again, if you let someone do something and pay a fee and they don't have parking, now where do all the cars go that are gonna be frequenting that property? It
Right.
just, you talk about going to residential neighborhoods, it's just gonna keep
Right.
pushing out.
And
So,
Alex Bay Avenue is a good example of that, where there's not really enough room to put on-street parking on Mallett's Bay Avenue, and the lots are small, so if you have a pay and fee, where are they gonna park?
Well,
You've
I
already said
think
you can't park in your
right,
neighborhood,
but I
so-
think the O'Brien Community Center has plenty of parking. It could be developed to a more regular parking, especially if not to a fund, so that that could be managed. Yes.
We have a exploratory agreement with Champlain Housing Trust to use part of that lot.
Oh, really?
So there is potential that
For-
there would be less parking there in the future.
Use
Not
it for
guaranteed.
development or use
Yeah,
it?
so they're interested in developing some affordable home ownership on the front of the lot. I don't know like how much that is, but it would reduce the size of the parking lot that's there. But the city hasn't agreed to that, that's just something that is.
well, I will tell you that the plan was always to have something developed along Mounts Bay Avenue on the
in front of
O'Brien
that
lot, so that's kinda always been talked about. The
Yeah.
problem is, once you start digging there, they buried the Richards furniture plant underneath there.
It's supposed to find down there.
There's, I know when they did, I think when they did the parking lot, took some borings, there was some, they ran into, steel and
Mhm.
gaps and crevices and stuff, but anyway,
Well,
that's another story.
I mean, it's,
But,
yeah.
but again, I think we gotta be careful about, eliminating parking there, where does it go? And the other thing is, if you're, I don't know what the distance is, half a mile from a parking lot, people won't use it. There's a certain distance that people won't walk, even though it's close. I remember having a conversation when we were doing the downtown, and someone was concerned because they had to walk 100 yards further from their office to where the parking was gonna be, and they didn't wanna do that. It's like,
There's a lot of psychology involved.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
Quick question, maybe if you know this, what kind of section of the city as far as zoned, what's the word for it? Permitted parking in the city, like certain neighborhood streets are permitted parking, like I know Platt Street is, I think Mansion Street is. Is
Yeah.
that something that the city's continuing with, or is that that was an old practice that's kind of?
Actually, it was a new practice when CCV was put in, because the students were parking in those neighborhoods. So the council was requested to make resident parking in areas, and it's Barlow Street, Mansion Street, Platt Street. I know it goes up Hood Street. I believe I don't know if it goes Leclerc and Hood, but basically an area around the downtown to try to dissuade the CCV students from parking in neighborhoods all day.
Okay.
So yeah, as far as I know, those are continuing. That's
Okay. I don't know if that's, just curious to know, like, expanding, or if that's what we're dealing with, or if, because like if we did have the was it pay in lieu? Like if, say for instance, there were very limited areas where they would direct that parking.
Yeah.
And could we ever have a different approach for each road of the gateway? I mean, because each
Potentially.
road is very different than the other.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
like the Mounts Bay,
yeah.
obviously is a tighter situation, so maybe you wouldn't.
Yeah, and the building standard for Mallett's Bay is much different than Main Street. It's intended to be more as you go further out Mallett's Bay. It's intended to be more more of a residential detached housing situation, less density, less commercial uses. Actually, it's exclusively residential once you get to a certain point
Yeah, but
on
I think
Mallett's Bay.
it's still, in all, I think it goes up to West Spring Street, where in terms of like the 4-story commercial first floor.
I don't know if any of Mallett's Bay is, so
I want to think that this area to
It's-
Spring Street roughly is, you know, storefront, I think you call it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then
exactly.
beyond that, it's
Yeah.
townhouse or whatever.
right, so the only place so that would be, it would be the urban general to begin with,
Yeah.
which allows for the option of first floor commercial or not. The only place where we require first floor commercial is in the kind of the center of Main Street.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's an option in that standard. But I mean, and yeah, I don't really envision this as you know, one size fits all technique. It may be that it's very different depending on specific circumstances. So but it is one of the options that we've found that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion, and actually I was in a meeting recently with some developers that were talking about how they could make up their parking, and they were looking at the properties behind them saying, well, we could talk to this owner to subdivide off this back piece because their lot's really deep, and we could bump out into that and put our parking in there. And it's the conversations are going into directions where I don't think we want them to go as far as how to meet the parking requirements when we're talking about potentially, you know, 4 or 5 spaces, which definitely can be a lot of spaces. I mean, it can make or break a development and really shift things around a lot. So I don't want to say that that's a small number, but it, you know, the conversations are being had is the point there.
Next question. It sounds like what's really in question here is this requirement of like one guest space at every 4 units, or I can't remember the exact number. Can we get data from existing multi-unit residences to how much of their parking they're actually using, like based on the current requirements?
I was wondering that myself, like the newest projects that we're seeing that have come, like Upper Main Street, are those at full occupancy yet? Can we kind of see how the parking is working there?
I think at 348, where the Fodang and Juniors is located, they're at capacity for
Okay.
sure. They have an adjacent lot at 340 that I believe they took the house that was there down to use that as a staging area for developing 348. That we have a memorandum of understanding with them that they can use that as local parking now until they redo that. Because parking is not a permitted use as itself. We don't allow parking as a use except in downtown as a parking garage.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Well, we could change that too.
Well, true. We could change that as well.
Sorry, I'm wrapping my head around that. So like the parcel, East Allen Street, Michael Bryan will know what I'm talking about. Imelda Mahoney's house in between Russell Niquette's and Dufresne's there. There was a house that burned down, a parcel that I believe Redstone bought exclusively
Oh, yeah.
for parking.
Right.
But because that's a downtown lot, that can be used.
So the parking that's there now, you mean?
Yeah.
So that was actually developed as part of the key development. So that was identified and to allow to meet the parking requirement of redevelopment on this site, and they, I guess, started moving forward with the parking development, and then the Strand project fell apart. Or
Okay.
didn't go forward, I don't know
Okay. Yeah,
actually
so
what
it's not
happened, so.
It's not parking for the sake of parking. it's
Correct.
just- okay.
It was being developed to support the use of the redevelopment of the Key Bank building,
Okay.
but then the redevelopment didn't happen.
So could, I think what you were asking, and if you weren't, I'm asking, since they were gonna use that for parking, could they still, if they wanted to?
Well, so the lot that they've developed is parking
And it's gonna stay
currently.
parking?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
gonna stay
it's
that-
already built as a parking lot. I think they've got 50-some spaces
But
over
it's gonna
there.
stay as
And it was
parking?
approved as.
I'm
It was approved for
just
parking.
curious as to why, like, for instance, it's a situation like the Main Street, the lot they acquired to make into parking, that's a conditional temporary.
Well, I'm wondering, the question that popped into my mind is if the same person owns both lots, why don't they merge the lots and the development, they've got a development on the lot and they're using that as parking?
And they could. They
Yeah.
could do that.
I do think that was acquired after they had,
But the point is the same entity owns both,
yeah,
so they could merge the lots.
yeah.
And I don't see why they
The-
couldn't use it as parking.
The other thing that happened with the East Allen Street is that was actually all permitted before the form-based code was approved.
Okay.
Formally, so that came in just before. That was probably one of the last projects that
Is
was
that in the
approved.
downtown? That's not
It
the
is.
form-based code, is it?
It is now. I believe it was probably in the commercial and central business district, would be my guess. That North Allen Street is in the central business district.
Right, but I think it was part of the downtown, I'm trying to, there's all these downtown designations and whatnot, but the downtown, the TIF district, it was included.
I don't believe it's included in that.
It is,
Is
because
it?
it fronts on East Allen Street. So the TIF district was anything that fronted on Main Street or East Allen Street from the railroad tracks to the river.
Okay. Then
So
I
it
guess
was
it
in the
is.
TIF district, so I'm wondering if that,
Yeah, so I don't know the specifics of it. That all happened
yeah.
well before my time here. So,
Can I ask a question?
please.
So when they developed the form-based code for the gateway districts, did they do an analysis of the parking in the back, that it was actually possible, or was it just an idea? I guess I'm just curious, and if they did, they look at what sizes are there, because this is huge, but ultimately you could have exceptions to the rule if the lot was a certain square footage, like below a certain square footage, then maybe it would apply for less parking or something to that effect, but I guess I'm just sort of
Yeah.
curious if someone had done any kind of analysis to say, hey, yeah, we could get 2 bays of parking back in here, and
I think I don't know if there was a specific analysis done in that regard. I'm guessing there was some level of analysis because we do have a parking setback line where all the parking has to be behind it. So in order to make that feasible, then I would presume that there would have to be enough room behind
to get.
that line to get the parking in. So, and a lot of those lots are I don't want to say they're really deep, but there are deeper lots along the road, along Main Street in particular, and
I think, though, the answer is that I think when they drew it up, there was adequate area for parking, but I don't know as they said, okay, this is gonna need, if you go 4 stories and
Right.
put this many units, you're gonna need this much parking.
there wasn't any type of build-out
Well,
analysis
that's
that
what
was
I
done.
was wondering.
Yeah.
And is there plans to do it that?
I've talked about doing one in-house so that we can help with the redevelopment of Main Street itself, to kind of give the utility companies an idea of what they can expect for new customers, but it's not a project that we've,
Right.
I mean, it's something
You could
we'd
a
like to
crude
do.
Analysis, but
We could. The challenge is identifying what properties might be combined and what properties are going to end up by themselves, and then kind of how to figure out what the use pattern might be. A lot of it's the economics and what people want to build.
right. But I mean, there could be an exception.
There could be, yeah.
I don't know if that's used quite often or not.
There could be. I know in they have a provision that allows for a waiver to a certain percentage of the parking requirements. We don't have a waiver specifically, but we do allow for reductions in the parking. So for example, if you can identify specific transportation demand management strategies like proximity to bus stops, like ride sharing, things like that, you can get a reduction in your overall parking amounts. We allow for off-site parking up to, I believe it's 10 spaces or 20%, whichever is greater, of your total number of parking spots that have to be a dedicated off-site area within about a quarter mile. We allow for there's other items like that already built in, and even with some of those reductions, the development community talk that they're having challenges meeting requirements.
No, as you were talking about, has a parking management plan waiver, if you will, where if you develop and you can do a parking management plan that includes public transportation, parking on another lot that you have control of the spaces on, et cetera. I don't know how well that's working over there.
Sure.
But I know that there are projects that have been done and that are still planned that are looking at that type of thing. Where can we find off-site parking? And I think they allow, like in downtown Burlington, you can use the public garage for a certain amount of spaces.
Right.
That type of thing.
Yeah, well, and we do allow for, as I mentioned earlier, we allow for the on-street inventory for a certain amount. And we don't do all the time. If somebody is having a challenge meeting their parking and there's on-street parking nearby, we might.
But I guess what I'm driving at is if I buy a lot or a couple lots and I want to put up a project and it's going to require that I have 30 spaces on site and I can only put 20 on site, then is there a provision where I can say to you, okay, I went to John Smith and have an easement to park 5 cars there. I'm putting in, 5 bicycle parking spaces that maybe can offset some of the parking that was needed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so we have those in place now for certain.
Yeah.
You based off the total number of spaces that you need and the percentage of that. So,
Okay.
but one of the options that was included was doing some sort of parking management plan, and what I was envisioning with that was kind of on a project by project basis. If a developer comes in and says, I had my engineer put together this analysis that says, based on the uses, based on where I'm located in proximity to other parking that's publicly available, this is what I should expect for a number of spaces that are necessary on my project. And if they can, if an engineer would sign and stamp that with their seal, is that something that we would accept to say, okay, we'll take this in lieu of meeting our parking standards because you've done the analyses to show what the parking demand might actually be for your project.
But that's, and that moment in time, it's not future or something.
Correct. Yeah, so that have to be one of the considerations as well.
Because I was also curious, because we have done a parking study for the downtown area, correct? But have we ever done one for the whole city?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I was gonna say that too.
Because I sort of feel like we're shooting in the dark and
Yeah,
we need more data.
I
feel like.
totally agree, and I feel like we're looking at putting all of the solution on. Yeah, I do think we should take a holistic look at potential sites for public parking options around our gateway districts, including lots. I know where there's going to be a new lot next to the hotel, and that's going to affect things. And there might be other opportunities we've talked about, such as in front of the O'Brien Center. But also our existing street parking, there may be opportunities to increase on-street spaces. I think we have a few sites that are pretty efficiently allocated. At one point, Jesse had mentioned that you could increase the spots just by painting the spots onto the ground so that people aren't
know where to go.
Right.
Yeah.
My concern is it seems like, I'm sorry to cut you off, it seems like we're kind of shooting at a little bit of a moving target because a lot of our gateway redevelopments, by and large, what I was seeing was calling for a reduction of on-street parking. So if we're telling people, developers, you can we're trying to be a little more lenient on their on-site parking while also diminishing the city inventory.
Yeah.
It's kind of like pushing it in opposite directions and not really solving that.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
it's
one of the
gonna push
things
it
that
in
has
the neighborhood.
hit me right at the beginning is when the folks proposed the form-based code, and they had the storefront district, and they wanted to eliminate parking on one side of the street. It's like, well, you want storefronts, you don't want to have parking. It doesn't make sense to me in that respect. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think this conversation is going to take several meetings. We have to get more information. And we really, I mean, it would be nice to know what, in fact, the issues, specific issues that developers are coming up with. I know that when we talked about the developments, at the time, a lot of like residential and even some commercial were putting parking under the building. City Lights, did it. And you see all over the place where there's parking under buildings. That is an option.
Yeah, but it's
What's-
very expensive.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But it is an option, and it must be feasible in some sort of development. You see it in a lot of apartment buildings.
The building has to be of a certain size in order for that to be possible. So not every project will fit into that category.
Understood. But at some point,
Yeah.
and I don't know what that magic number is, if
Well,
it's.
it's so
if it's-
variable per site too,
Yeah,
and
Yeah.
it's just, that scenario is so conducive for the way we develop here, because we're such an urban space though.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think it sort of speaks to our environment. I mean, outside of the downtown, it's a little different, but
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see, right down, like in our downtown right now, we've got a lot of these huge buildings. And it would be kind of nice if like there could be some smaller buildings that would add a little bit more of a dynamic look. But if our policies make it so that it only makes it feasible for large projects to happen, then we're going to have.
but the way it's designed, it can make us look at small. So it's really about how they design the facade.
That's
I
correct.
do think you have a valid point.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we're probably just going to end up with these like monolithic
Monster.
Yeah,
developments.
exactly.
But that's the underground parking. That's prior to 20 years ago, we never used to see that in Vermont. Like that's kind of a
Yeah.
creative solution that has emerged as far as because like I remember when they put up the building on East Street behind the beverage warehouse. That was like the first building I saw in Winooski that had most of its parking under the structure, and that seems to be kind of what we've seen as the direction.
And the thing that hurts us as a public entity, the city, is where do you put other public parking? And, to build parking garages is not feasible unless,
Well, there is a solution.
they're doing it. But I'll tell you what, it's expensive,
Yeah.
and I'm not gonna put a lot of those up. And it used to be 25 years ago, there was grant monies that you could do that. You do a multimodal center and you get basically all the money, in grants, but they don't do that anymore after a couple of disasters in the state. But the city doesn't own plots of land along Main Street or East Allen Street where they could pop down a surface lot.
But is there,
Yeah.
I mean, but are there private lots that could potentially be leased by the city? Or is there, that's why I think an analysis of the whole city is really important.
Yeah, and another thing, so I moved here from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which a lot of people will say is not a model of ideal parking, but it is a good model of urban density and like a very walking and biking friendly city. But one of the things that they did, and I all say like this is different. I understand why it's this idea, but what they did is they took some streets that had previously been two-way streets and changed them to one-way streets so they could double the parking capacity on those streets, and that allowed them to have like small infill development without all the parking requirements. Now that
I'm not
is-
opposed to that.
That is a really easy way to double your street parking. And like, you have to be careful in your planning of which streets become
Sure.
one way, but.
That would require a very delicate approach, but that may be ultimately the way the
Just
city
do
needs.
it and surprise people.
You think roundabouts upset
We'll
people?
send them to the mayor.
Solomon was my idea.
But you know what's interesting? Burlington has just did a whole study of downtown, like 7 blocks, and they analyzed every street, all the widths. So there might be wide streets here that could potentially have more parking or
Yeah.
such.
Right.
It's getting people to your car
Yeah.
and have to walk, and nobody wants to do that. If people wanted to do that, then people would be taking the bus, people would be biking, people would be walking.
Well, and
People don't want to
to-
do that.
to
That's
be-
the problem.
From my perspective, I do still think that Winooski is not entirely self-contained enough to be completely walkable yet. We don't really have enough diversity in the services that we offer to be completely walkable. And so we can encourage that, but ultimately for people's basic needs, they often need cars to leave the city and go get other things or do other things. So we do need to kind of take into account that parking is something we live with.
Right. And in order to get people out of cars, it's a whole cultural change.
Well, I'm just
And-
saying,
No,
if
no,
we're
I-
talking about moving, allowing people to park, I mean, essentially, it's gonna push the parking in neighborhoods. Which is what I think, ultimately, what you were suggesting, means that people have to get out of their car and walk, and people don't wanna do that.
Well,
And that's what I heard this developer say at that meeting, that people, there's not enough parking on the street for his businesses, for these businesses. So that's kind of a problem.
it is a problem. It's a huge problem.
The-
Because, and it's like the downtown, it's, when we started the downtown, you think about, you're gonna put up a 923 or whatever it is car garage. You say, holy cow, we're never gonna fill that. It gets filled, you got a problem, which says there was success. So you can never plan big enough because you, monetarily, financially, you can't, you can't build a 1,000,000 car garage, and that it built. But that's the problem. As Main Street develops and as things succeed, there's a bigger demand on parking, and where do you put it? And do
Maybe we
have
should
enough?
have made Main Street one way and Weaver then we could have had parking.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you say that, but if you really think about it,
Yeah.
okay, if you were gonna do one way like that, that makes sense, because it's not very far a distance, you know what I'm saying? The problem is, Weaver was not built for all that traffic. And there's a lot of traffic that would be put down Weaver
That's
Street.
true. That's
So-
true.
And then the church.
Although, don't you, there might be less traffic going no, it's the same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
just-
think about in the morning and then the afternoon. Yeah.
Yeah.
For my own knowledge, the in front of the beverage warehouse.
Yep.
The owner of that,
Where-
that's a beverage warehouse, but they lease spaces, isn't that correct?
I
Yes.
think to CCV.
Okay,
Yes.
is it just a
I
CCV?
think so,
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I think
That's
it's-
something for the
I
new
think
mayor to
anybody-
find out.
Okay,
I
That's
think,
what I believe it to be,
Yeah.
yeah.
okay.
isn't it, I think anybody can lease a space, though. I think there's a
Yeah.
sign there that says that if you want to park there, that you just need to, I think.
So
You might be right, but I think, yeah,
I'm just going back to our previous discussion about lots as their like conditional use and being solely for parking. Wouldn't it's also again part of the downtown, but isn't that, that was once a separate parcel that's been
Yeah.
developed, unless there's some other project that's
used to be a gas station
brewing, yeah,
way back there,
there was a structure that was removed and it's now used solely for parking.
yeah.
I don't
But
know
I
if they've
think-
merged the lots with,
Yeah, I don't know what they've done, but,
Something like that is that, like, that is such a prime development spot that I would think you could only keep it as a temporary condition. Do you know what I mean? Where there might be places where it could be permanent,
it's
Right.
it's
But-
been that
Yeah.
way a number of years now.
but I'm sure it's just
Yeah,
a
but-
placeholder for future development down the road.
because the beverage
because
warehouse is such a cash cow.
Yeah.
it's-
You
Yeah,
think about it,
Mhm.
I mean, it's, an interesting thought is, we'll throw it at the mayor so she can bring it to the city council, but looking at, especially on Upper Main Street, East Allen Street, as things are happening now, are there some spots that could be leased by the city and made into surface parking? And is it something that is feasible for the city to do? I mean, there's gonna be a cost associated with it. And you think, well, geez, it doesn't cost money. There's a cost to it. And there's a cost to maintaining it and all those things. And so, all right, well, is there demand today, and do you rent those spaces? How many can you rent? You know, all that.
So maybe that's where the fee in lieu comes into play, right? Like,
What's that?
the fee in lieu might come into play, like if developers are paying
Yeah.
so that the city can then lease a spot from something else.
Right, so then it's, do you do that now, or do you wait until you get the money?
The other thing is that a fee in lieu option could be used for not just parking, it could be used for transportation improvements in general. So that could be adding additional bus routes or additional trips for the bus, or widening sidewalks to make it more convenient for walking, or increasing the bike infrastructure, things like that. So it wouldn't necessarily just be for parking related.
So,
But
as it's 7:30, we have another agenda item. I think it's a great conversation, good start, a lot of things to think about. So I think we have to keep going on this.
yeah, I guess what I would just ask is what information would help continue this discussion?
I think, can you get us the parking ordinance so we can all see what is there today? If you could get us a list of the issues that have come up with respect to developers in the city, not just the Gateway, but any place else that, I'm trying to think where else in the city, but anyway, what issues have come up with developers? So what the issues, what the problems are that we have to address?
And I guess examples of how other cities may have addressed this, and like dealing with exceptions, or there's certain things that we could start. Because I have a feeling it's not going to be a blanket, used
Yeah.
the same way in every street. I
Yeah.
think it's going to really vary. So I think it's really understanding the character of those streets.
Yeah. Christine, probably not, and I know you've had one meeting as mayor, but you were on the council for the last
Yeah.
year, so. I'm assuming there has been no discussion at the council level in terms of doing any kind of studies like we've talked about here.
No, there hasn't been.
Okay. The next meeting, we should talk about, well, that's what I was gonna say, the next meeting, we should have that conversation and maybe present it to Christine to bring to the council to have the discussion at the council. Because obviously, we can't, you know, start a study. Has to be something the council does. And maybe it's not, maybe it's gonna take us a few meetings to come to or look for. And if I think we need to have something like that done.
Right.
Yeah, I don't envision this being an easy conversation
No.
by any stretch, so.
That's why we get paid big bucks.
Yeah.
So just sort of related to this, but a little bit not related to this, and I don't wanna go off topic too much, but we had talked a long time ago, way before you were here, about impact fees, and I just wanna know where we're at with that, cause that kind of relates to this.
Right, so that's a good question. We, I believe, through the Regional Planning Commission and their Unified Planning Work Program, their UPWP, through their, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, are funding an impact fee study for us, or we're participating in the funding of an impact fee study. It's fairly early in its development right now. We are working RG on that study, so they're putting together some information for us to review and to
What do they
identify
analyze?
next steps. I'm sorry?
How do they do that study? I mean, what are they
I don't really
looking
know.
at? Like how much money they can,
I think they probably look at
Other towns.
other towns, what they're charging, what the fees are, and then,
There's
what the
also
implications are?
well, there's also some fairly strict, I think, state and possibly federal regulations on how impact fees can be collected, what they have to be used for. When you have to identify specific projects where the fees are going to be allocated and things of that nature. So it's
yeah, and I think they have to be the fees that you take for water and sewer, for example, have to be spent on water and sewer.
And they have to be spent within a certain time period. So there's a lot of the kind of the administration of it that's worked out to figure out how we want to proceed. But it is
So, there's an anticipated timeline for that? I'm just concerned because we had talked about this before, like as these big projects that are kind of now being filled, were starting to come online. We were talking, when they were just being permitted, we talked about
We
this.
talked about it in
And so-
2000 to
Lost
2004.
Well, that was before
Yeah.
my time, but
No,
in
no,
any
but-
case, we talked about this a long time
Yep.
ago. These projects are happening, us taxpayers.
Yep, I can provide a status update on where we are with that at the next
So,
meeting.
yeah, I'd
Yep.
like to know that that's gonna be like something that's gonna happen before all this development is
Right.
done.
The other thing that I'll do, and
And we pay for it.
I thought we had one of these documents, and that's why I was just looking. There was a parking study that was done in 2017 that I can review and see. Yeah, and see if there are recommendations that might apply further out. Yeah, so I can provide on that.
It is focused on the downtown, but it definitely incorporates like East Allen,
Part of the gateways.
up May, like it goes further out than just the TIF district. It's not the whole city.
Yeah.
So I can see if there was any recommendations specifically that might help with the conversation.
Okay.
Good.
I'm going to move us to the next agenda item. It's tough to get old when you have to go look over your glasses to read the large print here. Initial review of split zoning.
Split zoning, yes. So also in your agenda is a memo from me regarding split zoning and kind of the status of this. So really what this is coming from is in 2016 when the regulations, the land use regulations were updated, it included the form-based code as a new district and kind of renamed and reanalyzed the existing district. So all of our parcels were within one zoning district. And what's been happening with some of these redevelopment projects is parcels are being combined. And in some cases, they're combining properties in multiple zoning districts. So we don't really have a mechanism in place that will address how those properties can develop when they are split by two different zoning districts. So I did some review of other municipalities to see what they do, and in two instances, Colchester and South Burlington, they basically do the same thing, where they allow for one district to encroach into the other up to 50 feet. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's necessarily an appropriate approach for us to take. I believe, Joe, at the last meeting you mentioned about the fact that we've spent a lot of time identifying a vision and a direction for the community where we want this density in certain areas to protect the neighborhoods. So now allowing that density to encroach into the neighborhoods, are we going in the wrong direction there? So I don't know if this is really going to be an issue in the coming up, but it's something that I think we should be aware of and figure out what, if anything, we might want to do. And if nothing else, just to state that properties that are split zoned would have to follow the regulations of each zoning district on their property. So
Do you,
That's what it currently is now.
that's the way I interpret it now. But in reality, there's maybe one or two properties that are in this situation because everything was every property had one zoning district with the latest update to the regulations.
yeah, so no parcel was split by a zone.
Correct.
I'm thinking in particular one parcel at Upper Main Street that stretches very far into a residential district.
Yeah, so that's a case where it might be appropriate to allow for some sort of a split.
Well, the other thing is, when you brought this up, I was thinking about really the block between Spring Street and LaFountain Street, where you got deep lots on LeClaire and Main Street. I don't know what the depth is, but again, it goes to, and I don't know what happens on this side of Main Street, the depth of the lots on Weaver Street and Main Street.
Right.
It's similar. But allowing some kind of a movement of the zoning line may help with the parking issue that we just
Right.
talked about.
It could.
The concern I have is that we want to make sure that we keep the frontage on LeClaire Street and Weaver Street residential.
Right.
So
That's-
I don't,
On the streets.
That-
not being able to
reaching
tear
to
down,
the-
not being able to tear down a house to put parking all the way to Leclerc Street. So maybe it's looking at what the minimum lot size requirements of the zone or minimum depth of the zone and allowing, for example, if someone bought a lot on Leclerc Street that butted up to a lot on Main Street, allowing the zoning line to go back towards Leclerc Street to the point where there's a minimum distance
Protects.
depth from Leclerc Street. It's 100 feet, 150 feet, I don't know what that number is. But you know what I mean? So that it allows some flexibility, but you gauge it on the distance from Leclerc Street to where that new line is gonna be.
That-
And on Weaver Street, do the same thing.
That
As
makes
opposed
sense.
to the 50 feet, because I don't know if the 50 feet is gonna bring it, to the back of the house.
Right.
Or what it's gonna do.
So if I'm understanding what you just said, Mike, to bring it a distance from the road,
From Street.
where the road dictate where you measure from rather than
The
Property
residential
line.
street, the residential street.
Right.
Yeah,
It's almost like you want to maintain a minimum lot depth.
yes.
Do we have a minimum
Right.
lot depth?
We,
I'm assuming,
let's see, we
yeah.
have, I don't know if we have, yeah, I think we do.
Really?
I'm sure there's a minimum lot size. And
There is a minimum lot
frontage,
size,
and
there's a minimum
frontage.
Think about
frontage.
some of the ones on.
Purely from my observation,
Yeah.
from experience, Leclerc Street actually has relatively deep lots. The
Yes.
homes on the west side of that street.
House on the corner.
It's just, and it seems like you completely understand it.
Yeah,
As far as us talking about residential neighborhoods and preserving the character of our neighborhoods,
Yeah.
I would think that like Leclerc is one of our like ideal streets.
Right.
And so I'm just thinking about like, if we were to make it that you could join lots, it would threaten something like that.
and you can join lots. So the question is, okay, if
But-
someone
but
does
build
it.
Yeah, build it all the way out to the other street.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I own a place on Main Street and I buy the adjacent lot on Leclerc Street and I rip down the house and I put parking in the back, but I don't go all the way to Leclerc Street. Or I use that, I don't make a formal parking lot, but all my people park there.
Yeah, so suddenly there's a parking lot between two houses on
Yeah.
Leclerc Street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea, but I think we should look at
Let's-
the plan and see
Yes.
where it's appropriate or not appropriate. I mean,
Let's
to
just do it,
verify.
let's just do it with our
I'm
eyes
I'm
closed.
just like,
See what
I just want
happens.
to take the map of Winooski and start drawing.
Well, no, I think that's what we need for the split zone.
Yeah, we do have a
thing,
minimum
especially-
lot depth. I thought we did.
Just there or everywhere?
In our residential district, actually, all of our districts except downtown and our public districts.
What is it?
It varies. In the RA and RB, it's 100 feet. In the RC, it's 60 feet.
Wow,
In the central business district, the C1, it's 60, same for the C2, as well as the industrial district.
it's pretty little,
So,
Yeah,
60.
but I think if we had a map and we could kind of look
Yeah.
and see
Yeah.
what 100 feet does,
Yeah,
Because you could, if you've got a residence on Leclerc Street, for example, and a commercial residential thing on Main Street, there's no reason you couldn't use the back area for parking for both those properties. You know?
the thing is though, I guess if something did happen like that, I would imagine we would require them to do a traffic study to make sure everyone wasn't pulling out of those parking lots of the residential neighborhood.
I was gonna say that the thing you want to do is supervision, so access is on Leclerc Street if you've suddenly got 100 cars a day
Right.
going in and out of there,
So, I'm still wrapping my head around what this is.
Which is-
The news we got earlier that you can't subdivide a lot in residential district to be used for solely parking. So for instance, if developer had property on Main Street, acquired a subdivided parcel off from the back lot of a house in a residential district,
yeah.
they couldn't necessarily use that subdivided parcel solely for parking.
Right.
I think that's what
Correct.
we're trying to prevent, right?
Yeah.
That's what this
That's what we're trying to-
conversation is.
Parking is not a use except
permitted
in
use.
downtown.
Yeah.
But they could merge that adjacent parcel potentially with the
But
original.
accessory-
right?
I mean, parking is secondary to a use. So you're not, we don't allow for parking to be the primary use on a lot except in downtown.
But in that
For a parking
example, you
garage.
could, if you have a property on Main Street and then there's another house with a deep lot and
Mhm.
you buy the back half of that
Yep.
lot, you could then merge the back half of that lot potentially with the original property on
Yes.
Main Street. That would be the
That,
solution.
yes, that would be an option, yes.
And use it for parking.
And use that, yes.
But-
Yeah, we don't have a maximum amount of parking that you can build. You can build as much parking as you want associated with a use.
But nobody does.
Nobody does because it's
too
expensive, yeah. Parking is expensive to build.
I'm assuming accessory parking to a primary use in a residential zone is allowed, right? Because you have to have a driveway for a house. I'm not sure if it's specifically stated. And where I'm going is, I mean, I think it's obvious that you can park on your house, my driveway, I have room for 2 cars. The issue comes up, what if someone buys that and owns an adjacent commercial property and then puts, 20 parking spaces in the backyard? Is that something that
That-
we want to see?
We want to condone.
I think that also raises a different question, is that I know Burlington has ordinances. I've often wondered why Winooski didn't have them about creating impromptu parking spaces. For instance, like a lot of the properties at Main Street where the yards have just become effectively parking lots.
Actually, there is.
Is there?
I'm pretty sure you can't, technically, you're not
Legally.
supposed to park on lawn.
Okay, well, it seems to
Yeah.
happen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
'Cause I know in
Sure it does.
Burlington it's enforced, like
Yeah.
especially up in the university neighborhoods. If like even if you like, move truck on your lawn for a certain amount of time,
Right.
that's considered to be used as
Well,
parking.
That's a good point, which is the fact that people are doing that indicates that there are some parking challenges that
Issues.
they're facing that we should, otherwise they're not just doing it for fun,
Yeah.
I
What you
Drove
got
into
going
my
over
own
there?
house.
So I
I'm watching
basically
this
drew
film.
this example. So, here's Maine. And here's the Maine residential. This is a new commercial residential, and they're able to come into this other property area, but still maintaining a 100-foot setback from the street, but maybe
Right.
they can encroach 50 feet, I don't know how.
Yeah.
But just visually, I need to see these things. So, but it is true, because when you get to this point, I mean, should these people hang out in their backyard and be looking at a,
That, and
That's
the
up to
other,
them.
the other consideration, parking and doing this, I was thinking about is lighting, because, and I just think of this from an example, where we live, that somebody built an accessory dwelling unit, and there's this giant light that shines in the upstairs of my house now. And so
That's
with parking lots and things like this, when you're encroaching on these neighborhoods and building parking behind and subdividing lots, then they're lighting up these areas, and then it's creating light pollution for that neighborhood.
So
So
aren't
that's
there
just
ways,
another
and
aren't
the way
there,
they address that is that you have to do a lighting study. You have to present photometrics and show that there's no light trespass onto the neighbor's lot.
Yeah, we would require that as well, that they provide a lighting plan, and there is requirements
Do
for
we
the-
already do that?
Yeah, we have
Okay,
requirements on
okay.
lighting, that everything be downcast and
Okay.
shielded, so it's not
Well, they
spilling
don't
off
do
the
that with your
property.
except for next to
traffic
your house, and it's a spotlight right in the
Actually, I
window.
have the same problem as with my neighbors as well.
Believe me,
It's, I think it's normal places.
when I was on the council 18 years ago, there was a big issue where the person was doing it for spite, right in the neighbors, and it's like, really?
Yeah, they should be reprimanded.
Yeah, but anyway.
I do think it sounds like the 50, up to 50 feet, like that could be, I don't know that that's the exact metric that we want, but that could be an acceptable solution.
I think
Well,
we
it
really
depends
need to
how big
look
the
at,
lots are. We
Yeah.
need to look at the,
Yeah.
could you, for
Look
the
at a
next
plan.
meeting, could we get the map with those, minimum lot numbers so that we can actually look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I can try to put something together for the next meeting, yeah, to give you an idea of how deep the lots are and just configurations to see what it might look like.
And I think that we're talking about between Leclerc and Main Street. I think you get lower, Class Street, those lower, going higher, they get narrower too, so.
but you could, I mean, the same thing could happen where they could be consolidated and then
Yeah, and that's,
Right.
and that's why
So I think
I,
you need to look at the whole street.
right, no, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
But that's why I threw in the kind of a minimum depth from the residential street, because if you go 50 feet from the existing line, you may be almost entirely into the, you know, that lot, use up that residential lot. I don't know if that's the case or not, but
Are we looking at all the gateway streets?
I think we,
Or-
I think this is citywide. This isn't for any one specific area. Granted, there's only so many instances where we have,
Well, the commercial
Well-
only applies to so many places, right?
right, and
think
so does the
where you would-
gateway, but the gateway is probably where we'll see it the most.
I think I don't know as we have to worry too much about residential because lots are established, you have a lot size. I couldn't cut off 10 feet in my backyard and give it to my backyard neighbor because now my lot's not conforming. You know what I mean? So, and if I've got a lot that's 200 feet deep and my neighbor has one that's 100 feet deep and I sell them 50 feet, as long as our lots are still conforming to the zoning, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I don't know, I'm just trying to think where the different, I think the conflict is where there's a residential zone up against a commercial
Yeah,
zone.
right.
So maybe that's what we should concentrate on, is
I
where,
think-
where commercial and residential meet.
And I think that's what we're largely thinking is in the gateways.
Yeah.
That's why,
And-
that's kind of why we're focusing on that, and
Which brings
ironically
up,
enough,
which brings up another thought in my mind, because a lot of places, there is a requirement in a commercial zone or industrial zone.
There is, yeah,
Do we
we
have that?
do require buffer in, when there's basically a residential on a non-residential, there are buffer requirements.
Buffer meaning
Yeah, but-
vegetation buffer? or what
I
kind
believe
of
it is
buffer?
vegetated, yeah, but distance and vegetated amount.
What I'm talking about between a commercial zone and a residential zone,
Mhm.
a buffer of some kind. So if we could get that language too,
Yep.
to see what that is.
is it part of the reason why we never adopted that with form-based code is that we don't really have the land mass to kind of,
It didn't adopt what?
a buffer zone kind of,
I'm not sure that we didn't.
oh,
So there is, in the form-based code, there is what we call the neighborhood manners provision. So
Right.
in areas where we do want to protect the residential areas, wherever the neighborhood manners areas exist, there's a requirement for and
okay.
Like,
still
20
park up to that. You can park in that whole area, so it's not as if it's a protected strip. It's just an area that needs to be maintained in there's certain stipulations for development that can't occur, but can occur up to a certain distance, and so
Okay,
there's some limitations on it, but not everywhere in the form-based has those requirements.
okay. I just asked because I live right on the edge of the Gateway District. And
Yeah.
so kind of as development continues, like the contrast might be pretty stark between the Gateway District and the residential.
Yeah, it could.
But, yeah, so the gateway has some kind of a buffer. I want to think it's like 20 feet to 50 feet,
It
depending
is.
where you are.
Yeah, it is, depending on where you are.
The buffer area.
That's good.
But I think we should look at other.
But again, you can still uses area, you just can't.
No, but there's a screen.
There is screen requirements,
So-
there's fencing requirements in those areas also, yeah, fencing and landscaping.
But could you
In the
just do a
gateway.
fence and park right next to it and not have vegetation? Or
There,
would
I,
you still, you would require to have vegetation as the buffer? part?
there is, but it's not a lot of vegetation, so it's not like it needs to be a 10-foot deep vegetated strip as well. It's basically the fence and then a certain requirement for trees along that of a certain caliper, so in effect, you could park right up to it, yeah, it is possible.
Interesting. And something like that, does it require to maintain that buffer? Because you could see, we're just gonna put these trees in and then they never maintain them and
Or
then
a
they'll go
fence.
away and then.
I
And
think
if
there
you
is a
have an
provision
effect-
that they at least be kept alive for a year or two or something like that after the development, but
But I think.
I don't know if there's an ongoing maintenance.
I think that we talked about there was ongoing maintenance plan for at least.
Well, for instance, they would be kept
Yeah.
in good repair,
But
but as
again,
far as
the
the
problem with
landscaping,
What's that?
I said the vegetation is, for me, it's even more important because all that heat is gonna just gather in that parking area. Without those trees, it's gonna just
Well,
No,
trees
it's
and
pretty
shrubs
miserable.
and whatever, yeah.
To be in your backyard next to a parking lot.
Okay, I can bring
Anyway.
back some mapping and some other language on what we currently have for buffers for a future meeting. I don't wanna say the next meeting, just in case. It's a lot of stuff coming to the next meeting already. But at a future meeting, for sure.
Okay.
Yep. All right, anything else on the split zoning, Madam Mayor? You know, you can join us at the table if you'd like. I know it's only 10 minutes left in the thing, but